welcome to the last lunchtime lecture. I'm passing it over to Karen to get us started with an introduction.
Hi, I know a lot of you already. I'm Karen Stryer from the Anthropology Department, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend and the Tinker Visiting Professor of the semester, Fabio Feldmann. Fabio is a Brazilian lawyer and environmentalist and an activist who played a leading role in a lot of the Brazilian legislation in favor of the environment. He was a three-term elected deputy from the state of São Paulo, and maybe his most distinguishing contribution, at least to the rest of us, was that he was the author of the environmental chapter of the Brazilian Constitution. And so we like to say we have Atlantic forest and other parts of the environment still left in Brazil, in large part because of the legislation that Fabio was responsible for introducing. He was also the secretary of the state of Ministry of the Environment for the state of São Paulo, which is a state that has, as many of you may know, the income of greater than the country of Argentina. So it's a powerful state in Brazil. And he has his prominence in environmental issues and forward thinking long before most people were really thinking about these earned him a very prominent role as the leader of the delegation from Brazil during Rio 92, which was the global climate change meetings that started many international efforts. Fabio has established NGOs in Brazil. He's been on the board of CI, Greenpeace, a lot of other places. He was responsible for initiating an environmental component to the Brazilian Bar Association, so that lawyers in Brazil also care about the environment. And he was the founder of the Brazilian Forum on Climate Change, which is chaired by the President of the Republic of Brazil. So Fabio is a longtime colleague and friend of mine, and our connections through policy and, in my case, practice of conservation have converged increasingly over the year as I think over the years reflecting what's happening in society, I think in a good way for sure. And thanks largely to Lassis and especially Alberto, who made possible this access that we were able to bring Fabio here in 2023 as a speaker, and then now as a visiting Tinker professor, to give us time to not only all of us to learn some of what Fabio has to teach us, but also really special for me because it's given us a chance to develop our collaboration even further and make some progress in our course, which we've been co-teaching, and it's great to see some of our students here as well from that. So thank you, Alberto. And thank you, Fabio, for coming to Madison and for agreeing to give this talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alberto, that we know each other for a long time too. When he was working in National Wildlife Federation. And National Wildlife Federation played a very important role in some discussions in Brazil, but helping Brazil to play an important role in environmental issues. Then my idea is to talk about COP30 that will take place in Brazil next year. Thank you, Karen. As she said, we know each other for a long, long time. I'm not supposed to tell you how much time in order to preserve her privacy, but a long time, you know, Jacob, you know. And it's, for me, Alberto, has been a great opportunity to be here because, as you know, Karen is a very important primatologist around the world, but Karen is playing a very important role in Brazil, saving the biggest Brazilian monkey called Muriqui, and you'll see the Muriquis in all slides. It's our negotiation. Jacob. I help you, but you must include the wiki
And
at the end. Okay, people. First of all, I would like to emphasize what I consider one of the most important initiatives in environmental issues. This is the creation of IPCC. I think IPCC is so important because when you talk about climate change, the IPCC is the most important scientific reference to climate change. And it was created before the Rio conference. And it, in my opinion, is a very important initiative because provides IPCC scientific assessment to policymakers. And you know, it's we created the IPCC of biodiversity some years later, and it's called IPBS, Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. But you know, if you want to know anything about climate change, you must go straight to the source, is IPCC. They release many, many important reports. The first one was in 1990. If you see the report, you'll see that it was just the beginning of the idea to compilation of scientific studies about climate change. But it's very important, in my opinion, because when you see the convention, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it was based in the first IPCC report. And to give you an idea, I emphasize this, the first report said that there is a great probability that climate change, the global warming more specifically, is caused by mankind. But it has many doubts about this. And the second, the fourth IPCC report, and I think this is really important, they recognized the role of mankind in global warming and the effect of tropical forest deforestation on climate. You know, this is very important because when you go discuss climate change, many people can say, oh, I believe that there is a global warming going on, but it's not caused by mankind. This person doesn't believe in global warming. They attribute the changes on what is called in the convention, it's natural variability, but I don't want to go in details. And as we are talking about 2007, this report had a great impact in global public opinion. And the idea is to discuss this in the Copenhagen COP that I mentioned very fastly, but it was a terrible disaster. And why is important for the Brazilian countries and Congo and other countries? Because it was the first time that the IPCC recognized the role of deforestation in the as a very important source of greenhouse gases. And at that time, the discussion was that something from 12 to 20%, but it had a very, very great impact in the discussion, and especially because Brazil was one of the big emitters of greenhouse gases, and Brazil, unhappily, is the biggest deforestation country in the world. After this release, this report, as I'm saying, it's a great impact in public opinion, and the Nobel Prize was given to IPCC and Al Gore. And it's important because, you know, in front of public opinion to receive a Nobel Prize is very important. You know that better than I. The last one report is number 6, and if you follow all the reports, you can see that now we have a much better scientific understanding of climate change based on more extensive and accurate data. You know, here probably Alberto, we are the oldest in this room, but at that time, in the 90s, and even in the beginning of the century, satellite image was not so important as it is today. I talk about this later. And what was important, the last report, is the emphasis on human influence on extreme climate events. Heat waves that are killing many people around the world, have rainfall and droughts. In Brazil, we have the worst flood tragedy in the south of Brazil. And we are just facing now in Brazil terrible drought in the Amazonian region, but we never faced this before. And the next one. I don't want to spend much time this. The first big conference was in Stockholm, 1972. And at that time, Brazil was in a very conservative position regarding environmental issues. Brazil, India, the president of India was in this conference, and there is an idea that this concern about environmental global is a kind of conspiracy against the development of countries like Brazil and others. But when Brazil decides to host this conference, Brazil, in my opinion, was recognized as a very important player in environmental diplomacy. You know, Brazil, it's an important country, but Brazil is very important when you talk about environmental issues. To the deforestation, and because Brazil is a country considered mega biodiverse. And you have, in fact, we have 3 conventions as outcomes of Rio 92. You have the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's always important to say that was not ratified by US. We always discuss this. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's, I always discuss and caring about this. It's important if you want to work with climate change or biological diversity, read the conventions. They are not so large, but see the original source, that is the convention. And the UN Convention, UNFCCC, you have a very important article that says that what's important is preventing dangerous human interference with climate system. This is the idea of the convention. And how you work with the conventions is the convention creates a legal framework, legal regime on climate change. The first conference of parties was held in Berlin in 1995. And the Convention of Climate Change, the idea that you have quotes every year. When you talk about biodiversity, it's every 2 years. And I don't mention there is another convention, this UN Convention against desertification, but it has not the political significance of these 2 boats. You know, when you talk about land degradation, you must go to see the UN Convention combating climate change. then you have is the most important decision-making body, and it's like a condominium when you have the assembly of the of the people in the condominium. And you have the first one, and it's interesting because when they read the convention, they say, okay, this convention is marvelous, everything is written there, but there are a lack of schedule and commitments. Then they decide to create a protocol to establish goals in a calendar. And that meeting was in Japan in 1979. And this is important for you to know. It's a traditional custom of UN. The protocol was signed in Kyoto, that is called Kyoto Protocol. You have other UN conventions, like, for example, Ramsar, that about wetlands. Ramsar is the name of the city that the convention was signed. When you see the documents of Rio, you see Rio Declaration and so on. And then you have, in my opinion, the most important goals, the Kyoto and the Paris Agreement. What is the difference between Kyoto and Paris Agreement? First of all, I was in Kyoto. To give you an idea how different was the world at that time, no one in the conference could suppose or imagine that China becomes to be the biggest first emitter in such a large economy. And the idea in Kyoto, the treaty, was based on what we called common but differentiated responsibilities. The idea is the following. If industrialized countries began to the ambitions in the time of the Industrial Revolution, they have historical responsibility facing the problem. The question is that under this mindset, China, Brazil, and India were not supposed to have any commitment to reduce, because you have common commitments like to make the inventories, national communications that all countries must have. And at that time, US was the big emitter. And what was important in Kyoto Protocol is the creation of the international carbon market. It was created there, and the representative of US at this negotiation was Al Gore as vice president of US. But to give you, at that time that Clinton was president, the American Congress, especially the Senate, approved unanimously a resolution saying to the executive, to the Clinton government, we will never ratify the Kyoto Protocol, at that time. And it was unanimous, Democrats and Republicans, to give you an idea about the strong reaction against the Kyoto Protocol. What is the difference between Kyoto and Paris Agreement? Karen did with me this presentation. When we are discussing if the idea we are on the same boat or we are on the same planet. I win. It's very difficult, My students know that it's difficult too, but let's go both. And new tools and instruments are created at that time. First of all, if we are all in the same boat, we all must have commitments to reduce emissions, all countries. And the climate jargon that you use is national determined contribution as a legal obligation for all members of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. It's a detail, but United States, for example, the first Trump administration withdraw US from the Paris Agreement, but US is still member of the UNFCCC. To give you, then you have, normally you have two different meetings. You have the COPs and what is called in climate jargon, meeting of parties. Then you have the COP of UNFCCC, and regarding the Paris Agreement, you have at the same time a meeting, but it's different, these two meetings. And what is the main goal of the Paris Agreement is to admit the increase of temperature until the end of the century to 2 Celsius degree or 1.5. It seems that it's a very small difference, but the consequences are really dramatic. If the goal is 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5, and the baseline is the levels, pre-industrial levels, when you see the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And you are just now introduce new modalities of carbon markets. As I told you, it was created in Kyoto, but now we have different figures of international carbon market. We have after Paris some important meetings, but I don't think they are so important as Paris. And we had one meeting that was finished 2 weeks ago. It's Azerbaijan, that's in Baku. And we are discussing, it's absolutely failure or not. No, it's not so absolute because there was the recognition and the importance of the participation of indigenous people in the process, decision process making. And you have the final regulation of international carbon markets. It's the Paris Agreement in the Article 6 discuss and establish some provisions about carbon market. The final negotiation was in Baku, 15 years later. This is important, 15 years later. And what is this discussion? We are discussing, Karen, if we talk about COP in CADI, the biodiversity COP, in the discussion is the gridlock now is transference of financial resources to finance countries from the south. This discussion we are discussing, but it's very long discussions. If you see what was decided in Rio, there was a decision there that it is a transference of 1.05% of gross national product to country. All countries have to give this money to help other countries. Never, the only country that did this was Norway some years ago. And the great discussions, or the greatest discussion and challenge about climate change is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, deforestation, as I mentioned to you, it's an important source, but the challenge is fossil fuel. And we always trying to discuss some commitment to eliminate fossil fuels. And last year, you have a very ambiguous decision that we must gradually eliminate fossil fuels, but in this scope, we have nothing. There is no confirmation of this commitment, you know? And then this is always the question: what must be done regarding fossil fuels? It's the question, and we are suggesting some initiatives in the next slides. After, I went to many COPs. There's two last ones I didn't go because I don't think I have a special role there. No, I think it's important, but I didn't go there. And when you have some failures, the discussion is the COP the best locus to negotiate climate change? Always the same discussion, that. But let's remember that in Paris, as in Rio, you have the most important head of states in Rio de Janeiro. It was the biggest UN meeting ever. In Copenhagen, you have Obama, the president of China, Brazilian, Indian prime minister, but it was terrible failure in Copenhagen. And in Paris, Paris, it's important because you have all head of states there in Paris. And then my opinion is this is not adequate question because we don't have any other political international place to discuss this. It's difficult. Then now, when you see many articles, New York Times and other papers, even in Brazil, many people say, no, it's a waste of time. We are not supposed to keep going with COPs, but in my opinion, we have no other political place to negotiate this, and you have the conventions and some legal obligations. And behind the discussion of COP, you have this discussion about multilateralism. It's always the same discussion, And when you see US always discuss the role of multilateralism because if you are the most important economy, the most important country in the world, it's not easy to be a protagonist in such negotiations. And you have problems in the multilateralism that we discuss in class. We are talking later, because you have countries like US, Brazil, India, China, and each country has one vote. And you have a country called Tuvalu, who is a Pacific island with 3,000 inhabitants and has formally the same power, the same vote. And another question is UN meetings, you don't have voting. This is very important. You have you must accomplish a consensus. And consensus is difficult. For this reason, when you read a UN paper, you see sometimes very often, the language is very ambiguous. The ambiguity is to be used to have everybody in consensus with this language. It's very watered, the language. And now what's new is that President of Argentina is questioning Paris Agreement and threatening to withdraw from it. And we discussed this, but there are some ideas that these people, extreme right leaders, are organizing a meeting in Brazil next year, a parallel meeting in order to discuss global warming. I'm telling, but I'm not putting in the slides because I don't want to publicize this idea. But if it happens, it will be very dangerous because it was the first time that you have this kind of contestation of global warming. If you have Milei, Orban for Hungary, even Trump, it will be the first time that we will have a new political landscape. But the question of Argentina is dangerous. If Argentina decide to withdraw, and to give you an example, Argentina hosts 2 COPs in the last year. 2, not only 2 COPs. Next. What are the prospects for COP 30? First of all, it's important to emphasize that COP is not a national meeting. COP is a UN meeting hosting a country. Then, when we are discussing the COP in Brazil, many people think it's a Brazilian meeting. It's not a Brazilian meeting. I suggest you to get there, but when you get there, you know that the location is responsibility of UN. The security is responsibility of UN. Then the COP will take place in Brazil, but it's not a Brazilian meeting. Why what can be the advantages of a COP in Brazil? First of all, to have a COP in a tropical forest place. There is a symbolic meaning of this. But again, when you see the agenda, you will discuss deforestation under the climate change jargon, that's LULUCF, land use change in forestry, but it's not a COP about deforestation. Deforestation must be discussed, but it's not a special coping from a diplomatic point of view, focusing only on deforestation. Why it's important? Because Brazil was present in G20, Karen is participating in the discussions of G20 as representative of American Academy of Sciences. And then the first time that Brazil Brazil was in this important role to be president of the G20. The last was India, and the next one will be South Africa. And the process in Brazil is very open process. You have a strong participation of civil society and a strong participation of scientific community. And Barbara Karen is in charge of the engaging of all science academies of American countries, from all Americas, And in Brazil, she is now a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. And this is important. And the final result was important because you achieve some political important outcomes, is reaffirming sustainable development goals and the need to combat global hunger and climate change. There is always a discussion, okay, it was a very expensive meeting, $100 million, especially for a country like Brazil. And many people, why are we wasting so much money? But the question is, it's a commitment, an international commitment, and can be a basis to be discussed in other international locus spaces. And Brazil, as I mentioned, has the potential to regain its preeminence in global climate change discussions and solutions. Why I'm saying that? Because we have a president in Brazil, before this president Lula, He is very conservative regarding climate change. He stimulates in Brazil deforestation. He stimulated in Brazil illegal gold mining. And to give you an example, he considers himself the most important admirer of Donald Trump. Then, and to give you from a legal point of view, how difficult it was to us, we have to go to the Supreme Court to have some decisions saying that the government must obey the Brazilian Constitution and must fight deforestation. It's a really very difficult time for us. And now Brazil is trying to recover its protagonism in environmental issues. And what happened in COP29 and COP29, that it was caused by oil producers in an arid landscape. And there is this discussion again, okay, let's not allow oil producers to participate in votes. This is ridiculous because what's important to have all countries in the same boat. And the last one was you have the largest participation of lobbyists from oil companies in the country. And what is the disadvantages of having this meeting in Brazil? Unrealistic expectations, especially with current global politics. I mentioned Donald Trump. I was in Rio, and at that time, in the negotiation, there was a discussion about the participation of US. And US had many objections about some provisions in the biodiversity conventions. And the US position that the biodiversity provisions can threaten the legal rights of pharmaceutical companies at that time. Then what happened? That we are not able to have a consensus, and the United States decide to leave. I always think, Roberto, if it was the best decision, because when you don't have the most important country in the world, it's difficult to have implementation, to have commitments. And now we don't know what happens if Donald Trump decides to withdraw. Anyway, it did in the first mandate, and we survived. Then this is the idea. What Brazil must do now? First of all, Brazil has some internal discussion about who will be the president of COP. And to give you an idea, the host country plays the most important role in the success or failure of COP. As I told you, there are, that I remember, 3 difficult COPs, one in Netherlands, and it was a failure. And I attribute to the host, the president of COP. You have Copenhagen. There was the presence of head of states, but we are not supposed to have a success. And it's funny because it was the first time that I see, because when heads of states go to the COPs, usually in the second week, the idea is the negotiations were ready and the head of states are there only to the picture. It was in Copenhagen the first time that I see presidents discussing themselves the text. It was completely ridiculous. Then for me, it's very important to see who will be the president and what is supposed to do in the next months. And when there was a book released a month ago about the most important negotiator of US, it's a memory. And what was important for Paris was to have a bilateral agreement between China and the US. When they get there, you have an agreement before. Then this is who will be and how Brazil is preparing the negotiations when in November that you have most of the negotiations done or prepared. And then we have a logistical challenges of COP30 is provide a good infrastructure to the official meeting as well the parallel events. This is important because, as I mentioned, Copenhagen, I was in the line waiting to have access to the place of the conference 6 hours, and there is no. For this reason, I am so glad to be here because after Copenhagen, I survived this snow. And guarantee reasonable accommodation to thousands of participants, we are talking about 50,000 people going there. And what are the challenges to the Brazil effectiveness and leadership? First of all, keeping reducing deforestation. It's a moral obligation for Brazil. Second, this is the question. Brazil now, the most important challenge for us is the exploitation of oil reserves in the west coast Amazonia region. And this is difficult because if I'm saying that the most important challenge is to eliminate or to reduce use of fossil fuels, what Brazil will do with this? I'm just proposing a kind of plebiscito, knowing that probably we will lost the plebiscite, but I think it's not the decision of this war because it's so important. And, it's the case of Norway. Norway is one of the biggest producer and exporter of oil around the world, is the biggest financier of a fundo to save the Amazon region called Fundo Amazônia. Then, for Brazil, I think if Brazil decides not to use this oil, it can change the game. But in my opinion, it's not probable that it would happen, this decision. The last one is how Brazil is planning to work with their climate agenda. Because as I'm saying, that there are many conflicts. Brazil has one of the biggest oil companies in the world, and to be president of this company is more important than be minister in many areas in Brazil. It's the biggest company in Brazil. And he's saying, we are going to drill the oil. And the environment minister said, no, you are not. But then it's important to see, can you lead this discussion within the country? Other activities before, during, after COP. I'm talking about this for a while, that I think we must internationally amplify climate litigation. Because, it's a very practical and effective way to put pressure on governments. And, just now, this moment, you have a very, very important discussion at the International Court of Justice in Hague. Tuvalu, that is a country, a small island, and some other vulnerable countries are suing the most important nations, saying in name of the future generations and in order to keep Tuvalu alive, you are supposed to reduce emissions, especially from fossil fuels. It's just happening now in Hague. And this is, I am discussing for a while because I don't think we have real, very important litigation against oil companies. What is the problem? See the case of Petrobras. Petrobras is a state company, but Petrobras has is in the New York stock market. What's my problem? Because I have no doubt that the oil companies will exploit until the last drop of oil in the road. I have no doubts about this. And the problem, when the oil was finished, they probably would distribute the profits to the shareholders, and they will have no assets to compensate the damages. Then we are discussing this. I was discussing Karen about this, but the idea is you must allocate some provisions to face the damage in the future. Because if they have no assets, how can they to face the litigation if we win the suit? In terms of Brazil, we have problems of the compliance and effectiveness of the legislation. I have no time. I know that I have 2 minutes. But, enforcement of legislation is difficult in Brazil, many other countries, even in the US, if you read the papers. And in the case of the Amazonia, in Brazil and other countries, we are facing the terrible problem of organized crime there. This is a real challenge. And now I am trying to engage new actors, is equivalent here in the United States, a general accounting office. You have a Brazilian national and state general accounting offices, because in my opinion, they can put pressure on the governments to enforce the legislation, because the problem is implementation. Even in Pará, where you have the COP, the government is saying that he loves nature, that he's against deforestation, but when you need the military forces of Pará, it's very difficult to have them. Then what can be done? And next one is the finish. You can see, no, come on. What's more important than the last one, please? No, I won't show the Muriqui, please. This is the Muriqui. It's not Muriqui.
That's the word.
Then I'm open. Thank you for your thanks. Thank you, Carrie, again. I make very few jokes.
Sure, go. And then we'll let.
We hear that dairy activity contributes strongly to the deforestation in the Amazon basin. Making this the boy piranha could one affecting that how to mitigate the problem.
Mitigation is always a problem. There are good initiatives now. One of the most important greenhouse gases is methane. Methane is when you go to the supermarket and you buy food. If you buy food and you don't use the food, you waste this food. This food emits methane. That's a very, very important from a perspective of potential global warming gas. The life is a short life time. Then I think I don't have much time, but the question when you talk about climate change is mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, of course, is the most important in terms that you must reduce emissions. But adaptation is becoming so important because, not only when you talk about natural disasters or climate disaster, because climate change is affecting economic activities. In Brazil, for example, Brazil is very competitive because Brazil exports soy. And when you have in Brazil 3 harvest seasons, the third one we have because there are some rains in this area. With climate change, the risk is not to have this third season because we are not supposed to have the third season rain. Then it's not a direct answer to you, but we must, in any sector, see how can we mitigate. And let me say that I discovered that we are almost cousins because he's Hungarian, I am Hungarian. His name is Steven, but in Hungarian language is Istvan. That's okay. And we discovered that we are cousins. Joking with you, Steven. Tony, thank you.
This is maybe an unanswerable question, but something that came to mind when listening to your talk. How many people, individuals, would you need to convince to actually fundamentally change the trajectory of the climate today? In other words, is it 100 people, leaders of government and some businesses? Is it 1,000 people? Is it 10,000 people? In other words, how much of the world's problem around climate change is really due to individuals as opposed to society? Does that make sense?
I was discussing with Karen about this because I didn't mention here, but I am thinking with other people to organize some movements and trying, please cut the recording, please. No, it's a joke. It's a joke. Don't taking it so serious. Roberto, please explain who I am. But we are discussing that for the next year, we must put from 100,000, 1 million people in the most important cities in Brazil to manifest that we are in favor of climate change, in favor to fight climate change. Because, when you see US and you see even Brazil, the parliament is radically against us. Then I think what's the fear of politicians? I used to be a politician and a lawyer. How difficult for you to have a lawyer and a former politician. But the fear of politicians is election. We must mobilize. It's interesting because we are discussing, Karen and I lost, but it's so often, But, militation, environmental militation now is militation in social media. What we have to do is to put people in the streets who say we are against climate change here, there, and many other places. And what we have doubts if you are supposed to do this, of course, not after COP, but to put real pressure on the delegations in COPs next year and to put pressure on the Brazilian government. I see no alternative. You are all invited, not to go to Brazil. Karen told me not to invite them because you cannot provide accommodation.
So it seems like social movements are an important part of the story. You also spoke about environmental diplomacy. I liked that term a lot. I wanted to hear more about what that means, what that looks like. It sounds like before the COP, the diplomacy element is really important to get players on board. But I'm wondering, what does that look like?
I think there are two key new forms of diplomacy that, in my opinion, is important. Science, like diplomacy, that it's exactly what Karen is doing. It's diplomacy, science diplomacy. And environmental diplomacy is worrying me that environmental issues at the international community become so important. You must have not only diplomats, but you must have scientists, not only scientists. I don't want to discuss with you, Karen, again. I'm joking because everybody say, no, it's the role of the scientists. It's not the role of scientists. Science plays a role. It's very different. Civil society people, academic people, in others prepare to play a role in all these negotiations. No, this is, as I call, environmental diplomacy. Let me give you an example in Brazil. Some years ago, I went to a meeting that the idea was to discuss another international treaty, very important, is Montreal Protocol to regulate substances that destroy the ozone layer. And the guy from Brazil, that delegation, is the diplomat that is living the city, Montreal. He was not prepared. Now I think you must have prepared diplomats and make them with scientific advisory and important stakeholders to prepare the position of the countries. And I'm saying this in classes, you know, when you have a parliamentarian system, you don't have a problem that persists in presidential systems. The representation of the country is done by the executive power. But when you need the ratification by the legislative, like you have in the United States, as we have in Brazil, for example, you must engage parliamentarians in this process. If not, it becomes very difficult to provide the ratification. In Brazil, it should be easier until some years because we are discussing the obligations of other countries. Then everybody is in favor. Now, when the countries must have commitments, obligations, there is some new political landscape within the congresses.
Because I asked you a question yesterday, and the answer was so informative that I wanted to ask people too. I think one of the biggest problems that play a role in this situation is like the power of trust. People like both on the reasons they don't trust that all this damage that happened. They just think it's like all the things that is made up. And the other side, it's completely opposite. So this polarization. How can we communicate with both sides to say like, hey, this is important, no matter what you believe? I think that this is.
I think this is a very important challenge for us because I was discussing, Karen, that I call this a polarization trap. We must avoid polarization trap. What is polarization trap? Is, for example, to consider that climate change is an issue to be polarized. Climate change is an issue of science. It's an issue about future generations. Then we must try not to have this terrible polarization. And from my perspective, personal, it's a problem for us because you know that some people is radically against any measure of fighting global warming, climate change. In the other side, we never, or under many circumstances, we don't have support from the left. See the question of the exploitation of oil in Brazil. You know, all governors of the Amazonia is in favor. As I mentioned, if we have a plebiscite, we will lose the plebiscite, I think. Because, you know, from a short-term perspective, it's a good idea to exploit the oil. You generate income, you generate taxes, you can fight poverty in the region, in the country. But the question is, what about the rights of future generations? Then I have no answer. Only to give you my personal example, when we are just writing the Constitution, what we did at that time is to create a parliamentary front that includes people from right, left, extreme left, extreme right. I don't know if it's possible today, but we must try. For this reason, I was discussing with Karen about this big movements and march. My idea is not allow political parties, I think it's important they are there, but not to give them ownership, nor to try to have an important kind of a neutrality to attract all different people. Even musicians, we are discussing, sertanejo is a country music in Brazil. Most of them are in favor of Bolsonaro. Then it's important to have Caetano Veloso, Chico Buarque, but we must try to attract these people because they have the capacity to dialogue with different people.